Hey YouTube, I have decided after a break of a few years to possibly start doing some more photography related reviews and tutorials. And so I thought I'd start with a hopefully timely review of ON1 Software's PhotoRAW 2017, which is being marketed as a higher performance alternative for Adobe Lightroom. ON1 announced this program several months ago and took pre-orders for quite a while and finally promised a release in November. And 5 days ago on the 23rd, with a whole lot of fanfare and a 2 or 3 hour live streaming session with a lot of their experts, they released this version, pre-release version of PhotoRAW 2017. Now, there are a couple of things I want to say before I get into looking at the actual program itself. And the first is that I really want to like this program. I have become more and more disenchanted over the past few years with Lightroom as it's become increasingly heavy and slow. And I would really like to see a credible alternative on the market, whether it's PhotoRAW or something else, for non-destructive editing and cataloging. So I've watched announcements about PhotoRAW for several months now, and I've hoped that it would be excellent. And when it sounds like in a few minutes that I'm really kind of dumping on these guys, I am not trying to be a hater. I really do want this project to succeed, but unfortunately I just don't feel like it's there yet. A second thing that I want to say is that, as you can see on the screen, ON1 is labeling this as pre-release software. And in my opinion, that is probably being a little bit generous. I want to be fair to them, but I kind of recognize that what they're doing is basically saying, we have a lot of people who bought this, and we promised that it would be out in November, but we're not quite done, and we wanted to get something out the door so that they could play with it. Honestly, I really think that they probably would have been better to just take the PR hit and say, we're not done yet and we'll get it to you as soon as we can. Because there are several parts of this that are just clearly missing or broken or otherwise not ready for release. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look. This is the default screen that shows up when you load it on my Mac. And as you can see, there are, you have a fairly intuitive Explorer-like interface where you can kind of move back and forth between folders, and that's all nice and good and fairly responsive. A couple of minor nitpicks. The first is when the thumbnails are this small, which is how they came up by default for me, you can't see the folder names, which is not a huge deal, and you can fix it by making them bigger, but nonetheless, that's an oversight that really, I think ought to be fixed. Another issue is with the individual images, when they're thumbnails are small, all of the file name and kind of filtering information, the stars and the colors and stuff like that, is hidden. So if you make it small enough, then it's just not there. That's something that no matter how small you make them in Lightroom, all of that information is always visible. Another minor nitpick is that the file name is only hover over, at least in its default configuration. Now, if that annoys you, like me, you can actually fix it by going up to View and saying Always Show File Name. But again, that's something that I think probably ought to be fixed in the final version. With that, let's move on and talk about filtering. I have a couple of issues with filtering, the way it's implemented. And the first is, as you see, I just engaged a 1-star filter, and I have no items. And the reason for that is because filtering is not done recursively. So I don't have any photos on my desktop that meet these criteria, but I have hundreds of photos in subfolders on my desktop that meet this criteria. Now, I understand why they haven't implemented this, but for anybody who uses a hierarchical folder structure to organize their images, which is probably just about everybody, this is going to create a pretty significant problem. Again, I understand why they haven't done it, but, this is really something that I think needs to be fixed in a future version, because otherwise it's just going to be really, really difficult to manage any folder structure or go through and process it. It's a serious workflow concern. The second thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, and this is actually probably a bigger deal and more difficult for them to fix, is that there is no way to actually do any sort of filtering on any EXIF or IPTC metadata. And so, for example, you can't filter on things like your camera or your lens or your focal length or shutter speed or any of that sort of thing, all of which you can do in Lightroom. For the third time, I know why they haven't done that, and I'm sympathetic to the challenge of doing it using the model that they've taken. But that's something that Lightroom has done really well for years now, and frankly, it is an incredibly useful feature that I've come to rely on when I'm processing images, especially if I have multiple cameras at a shoot. So I'd like to see them implement something that does allow you to filter for those characteristics, perhaps in their indexed folders functionality or something like that. But certainly I hope that that's something that'll make it in eventually. One side note for anybody who's planning on buying this software for Windows, and that is that high DPI display scaling doesn't work very well. And if you have a high DPI screen on Windows, you probably are not surprised by that, because this is not unique to Photo Raw. It's something that happens on lots of software. In fact, it doesn't work perfectly in Lightroom either. So I'm not really being critical of ON1, but it is something I want to point out if you happen to be buying Photo Raw for Windows. So, moving on to looking at actual images. I'm going to go over here to Dropbox and then to Print Gallery. One of the things that ON1 is selling with Photo Raw is that it has a really lightning fast response, that you don't have to build previews, you don't have to do catalogs, you don't have to do any of that stuff that's really slow and cumbersome in Lightroom. Now, up to this point, I think you would probably agree that the performance has been pretty good. As a side note, I'm running this on a mid-2014 15-inch MacBook Pro with dedicated graphics and 16 gig of RAM. So it's not exactly a low-end machine. But one of the problems that I've encountered is, as you go into folders, if you haven't built previews, you'll note that things are really pixelated, and it actually takes a somewhat significant amount of time for those to render. I just hit the button to change to another image, and it's going to take several seconds before it actually gets there. And the reason for that is that Photo Raw hasn't built previews, and it's doing it in a somewhat intelligent way. My observation is I think that it starts doing it as soon as you get into a folder. But the main point here is that ON1 hasn't really eliminated building previews. They've just sort of moved it to a different location. And so it's not like you can immediately jump in and just have, perfectly good access to all of your photos. Now, again, I'll kind of jump back to a different folder, and you'll see something similar happen. It takes a little bit for the photos to load in. Now, once you've done this, the response is quite good. And my guess is that in all of their demos, they had already built the previews for all of the photos that we saw. And, again, if you're moving back and forth, it really does look quite nice after you've built those previews. So I'm going to move over to the Develop module, because I'd like to show you what Photo Raw can do compared to Lightroom in Develop with some of the images that I've shot. And this is where we run into, for me, what is probably the first and most major deal breaker at present. And that is, if you notice up here, I have a DNG file and it says that it is in 8-bit mode. And I can confirm that it is in 8-bit mode. This is a really big deal because basically it negates any benefit of shooting in RAW. Maybe you're out there saying, well, you shouldn't have converted your library to DNG. That's a whole different discussion, and there are reasons that you might want to do that. But in any case, if ON1 is actually marketing this to people who want to migrate over from Lightroom, which is kind of what all of their marketing indicates, this is a gigantic oversight. Now, I assume, although I haven't been able to confirm, that the final release scheduled for December will actually be able to support a 16-bit workflow for DNGs. Obviously, a 32-bit workflow would be better since Lightroom can produce 32-bit DNGs now, but currently there is no 32-bit support in PhotoRAW 2017, so I'm not going to hold my breath there. While we're in Develop, I will go ahead and point out that there are several things that are just not implemented yet. So, for example, navigation is coming soon. The loop is coming soon. The histogram is coming soon. The crop tool is coming soon. So, again, a lot of things are just not there yet. And in my opinion, some of these are things that really should be, especially the crop and the histogram. They're not that hard to implement, and they just should have been done well before this thing ever got out the door. So since I can't show you editing of DNG files, which is primarily what I have, what I did do was go to my memory card and pull out a memory card, or went to my camera, pull out a memory card, and luckily I have some images that we can use. And of course, this is actually a problem I've been able to replicate several times. If you click over here on the recent, you'll notice that I clicked on 9367, and what it loaded was 9230. So again, that's broken, which is kind of typical of the experience of using this. So you know, just don't expect things to work properly. So I'll go ahead and load this file up. A bit of backstory about this file. I found myself on top of a mountain in North Carolina in the fall. It was very, very cold. The wind was blowing about 50 miles an hour, and this is not a good picture. It's quite blurry. I would never put this in a gallery or really even process it, but it happens to be the only picture that I have right now, or one of the only pictures that I can use as kind of an apples-to-apples comparison between Lightroom and PhotoRAW. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the Develop module, and one of the things I'll note is that the transition is not instantaneous. It actually does take 5 to 10 seconds to pull up the Develop sliders as the file is getting loaded in. And that's not a huge deal, but again, it's one of those things that kind of goes against some of what ON1 has tried to present. This is a RAW file taken with my D750. It is a ISO 3200 30-second exposure. And this is the file in Lightroom. This is the file in PhotoRAW. And you can see that with the default settings, they're pretty similar. You can see the Milky Way here in the middle. This is a meteor that came down randomly. And that is Saturn over there on kind of the right side of the frame. And before I got on this video, I did a little bit of processing on the file, did that kind of stuff specifically, and got to something that looks like this in Lightroom. There's obviously not a ton of detail down there in the foreground, way underexposed, but this is kind of just a quick process. You can see the Milky Way, and things look a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is try to replicate this in Photo RAW. And I will fully admit I am not an expert in Photo RAW or any of ON1's tools, so I'm probably going to do this badly, but this will hopefully demonstrate kind of what you're going to deal with if you are somebody who's coming from Lightroom. One of the things that, and this is how I typically would start with an image that has a lot of dynamic range contrast in Lightroom, would be to pull the highlights all the way down and push the shadows all the way up. And obviously that hasn't gotten quite the equalization that I want, but I'll already note that over here there's this sort of ring around Saturn, which is not in the Photoshop, in the Lightroom version. Let me go 1:1 here. Actually, that is 1:1. Never mind. So already there's kind of an artifact there that we don't see coming out of Adobe Camera Raw. There is some detail present down here in the mountains, but not a ton. So what I'm going to do is go into the local adjustment brushes, and I think how I do this is do a linear top and add, and I'm going to bring this down and kind of bring some exposure down, and then I'm going to add a layer and do a linear bottom and bring the exposure up. I do actually like sort of how ON1 has implemented these linear gradient tools. It's not entirely intuitive to add the adjustment layers, I think, but I do really like basically how you move them and rotate them much better than Adobe's implementation. I think that that's really quite good. It's something I'd like to see Lightroom adopt now, actually. So you can see I've changed that. I brought the mountains up a little bit. I brought the sky down some. One of the ways that you can really kind of pull out the Milky Way in Lightroom is to increase the clarity slider, and another, which is basically a micro contrast filter. Typically, structure is something that does a similar function, and you can see it brings the Milky Way out a little bit, but not, I think, it doesn't have quite the definition and detail that you see in the Lightroom version. I'm going to make this cooler still to kind of get it matched up. And the last thing I'm going to do is add a noise reduction filter to kind of give this a little bit of a more fair shot when we start comparing them. That's probably a little bit too much. We'll put it down to 30 or so. So comparing these two images, it's the same image, but comparing the processing, I do have to say that I'm really not as pleased with Photo RAW's result as I am with Lightroom. And I have actually processed a few other images. I have some, not a lot, that I can actually do a one-to-one comparison on. But I've experienced similar results across most of the images. It does not seem to me that Photo RAW is able to get quite the same dynamic range smoothing as Lightroom is, and I have noticed a bit more noise in the Photo RAW images. I don't want to, just completely say that this is how it's going to be. Again, this is a pre-release version of the software, but it is a little bit concerning to me in terms of overall image quality. And no matter how slow or heavy or cumbersome Lightroom is, if it's able to deliver a better image, I'm going to use it, simply because image quality is the most important thing. One other thing that I will mention in case it matters, and that's been rendered, and now you can see it's very, very soft indeed. One other thing I'll mention is that somehow I have managed in Photo RAW to actually delete raw files without any confirmation and without knowing it. I think it's when I've tried to delete adjustment layers. But if you are using this to process actual mission critical images for people who are paying for them, I would be very, very careful and keep a backup of everything. I would really say that this is probably not software you want to be using right now in any sort of mission critical way, but if you are, definitely take precautions. With that being said, I hope that this has given you a little bit of an idea of what to expect with Photo Raw 2017. I am looking forward to the final release in December, or my guess is probably more like January when it comes out. And I really do want to like this piece of software, but to be completely candid, it is very rough around the edges right now, and it's really hard for me to recommend buying it based on its current state. This has probably been about a 20-minute video, and frankly, I'm really surprised that it hasn't crashed, because when you're actually using it, I've experienced crashes every few minutes. I'd love to hear your experiences with Photo Raw 2017, and I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have any questions or experiences or ideas for future videos, please leave them in the comments, and I'll try to answer those as quickly as I can.